Good evening. Good to be here. Our tonight's lesson will be talking about interruptions in our marriage and interruptions in our life. I know if any of us have been married long at all, we've had all kinds of different interruptions, anything from small interruptions to catastrophic interruptions, maybe losing a loved one. Verses I want to start with tonight is in Psalms 23 and 4. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you're with me. And that's the attitude we should take with our spouses and our wives. Always be with them, be there for them, and never sway away from them. And then in 1 Corinthians, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not proud, it does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always preserves. Love never fails. If we could all follow that right there, we could end this class right now, couldn't we? It would all be perfect, and our spouses would love us and would be in good shape. But on interruptions, how would you describe a fairy tale life? If y'all had to describe a fairy tale life, what would it be? We want to make this a discussion class tonight, so if y'all want to jump in there, what would your spouse be like? Be careful answering that one. Might get in trouble, so you have to be careful there. Your children, your extended family, and what would your job be? Where would you live? What type of home would you live in? And what would your church be like? And what would a normal day in your perfect world be? While we're thinking about some of those answers to some of those questions, how close of this fairy tale life that we're thinking of does our lives actually come to that? And in our fairy tale life, does it honor God, or does it honor your spouse, or is it more geared toward selfishness? A lot of times when we're thinking about fairy tales and what we really want out of life, it's more about selfish ambitions than thinking about others. And we all have some kind of basic idea of how life we think it should be and what we expect in ourselves and others, and what our marriage and families would look like, and how our jobs will go, and even what we'll do for rest and relaxation, and maybe even how our retirement will be.
I don't think a fairy tale life is what we ever really want.
No.
I think a fairy tale life is what we read in the book. But I think what we would really want is a family that love one another, that stay together, that we serve the Lord together, that when we die, someone that's coming up behind us, all those that from us, could say, my mother, my father, my grandmother, my grandfather, they were faithful to the Lord, they took care of us, and they took care of others. I mean, what happens?
That would be a great life there. It wouldn't be a fairy tale life. That would be the life of Christ, wouldn't it? That would be a great life for your whole family to be members of the church and love one another and get along. It's not very often that big families get along real well these days. But what we think our lives should be like, and what we are expecting during our retirements, and then maybe our jobs. How many of us, when we were 16, 17 years old, had our life planned out, knew exactly what kind of job we wanted, what we wanted to do, And then how many of us actually carried out that plan and made it? So I know when I was that age, my dream job was going to be a basketball coach. But after a few weeks or a few months working at Hunts Utilities during the summer employment, years ago working at Hunts Utilities was like a good job, and it was really hard to get. So after my last summer employment there, I was lucky enough that a guy decided to quit, and I was able to get hired on at that job. And then 40 years later, I'm retired. So I can tell you about the retirement part too, and it's pretty nice. Okay, as we move through the scripture, you routinely see lies interrupted. Joseph didn't want to be hated by his brothers. He kept having these dreams, and they were already jealous of him. And every time he'd have a dream, he'd tell him about it, tell his brothers about them, and then that would just make them more upset with him. And it kept on to that. Of course, it was God's plan, but it kept on that they finally sold him to slavery. And from experience with 4 brothers, when they're already mad at you, you don't want to keep rubbing it in. So, and Moses was content with being a shepherd for his father-in-law and remaining in Egypt. And David didn't want to be the target of King Saul's jealousy. And Jesus didn't want to go to the cross for us. But all those were interruptions in their lives where they was happy with what they were doing, but God saw to put an interruption in their lives. Sometimes interruptions are not interruptions. It may be God's plans for us to turn us in a different direction. Interruptions in our lives in the way things are supposed to be are part of living in a fallen world. Our lives are broken because our world is broken. Our marriages are broken because our world is broken. And then in marriages, interruptions can range from mildly irritating to frustrating to painfully devastating sometimes, depending on what kind of interruptions we have. Like I say, it can be from something small to losing a loved one, which is a serious interruption. But a lot of times when we get into our interruptions, we try to handle it on our own, and we don't look to God for help. How many of us try to actually handle everything ourselves before we finally break down and just ask God and pray to God for help? We do that a lot. I know I do. Try to take care of things on my own, and then finally you will look to God for help, and then things will work out. Interruptions, they can be caused in one of 2 ways. They can be caused by circumstances that are entirely beyond either spouse's control, maybe an accident or an unexpected medical diagnosis, a job loss, or any other outside forces can cause the couple to readjust their lives temporarily or either permanently. For us that are married and have had babies, when we were young, you could throw a few things in a suitcase and go off for the weekend or something. And now that you have kids, it's throw a few things in the suitcase and call 2 men in a truck, and then you can go. So it's about the way it is now. So the other way interruptions can cause in a marriage is through our own choices. Sometimes we make bad choices. And then usually the choices we make are usually self-centered for some reason or another, instead of thinking about the spouse and putting God first in our choices. We will make the choices that seems best to fit our plan at the time. And this is a choice that will be blessed in a marriage or family if you ask God to help you with that. And a couple might decide together to do anything from relocating to a new job to adopting a special needs child, or either some one of them deciding to go back to school for more education. But sometimes interruptions happen in a marriage because one or both partners make a bad choice. Choices are made in several different ways, but when we make our choices, we really need to think about our spouse because we are one flesh after we're married. And what we do and what we say really affects our spouse. We need to think of that before we think of ourselves. Because the people we love get hurt when we make the bad choices. And when we're making the bad choices, we don't realize sometimes how it affects our spouses. It may not be that big of a deal to us, but sometimes our spouses will take that much different than what we do. It depends on what kind of attitude you have during this time, what kind of situation it is. But we need to always look to our spouse before we make these choices that might have a serious interruption in our marriage. And one of the things, if you've ever been to any kind of leadership classes or anything, the first thing they tell you for a good marriage or being able to get along with people is what? Trust. Trust, definitely, but I was thinking of communication. I was doing a Steve. I was looking for specific words. I was looking for specific words. Communication. That's years you work, and then supervision. If you go to any kind of class, the first thing they tell you the problem is communication. This always causes some of the biggest problems. And how you communicate with your spouse is a situation that is affecting you and has affecting you physically, socially, emotionally, mentally, and most of all spiritually. Like I was saying earlier, the communication we have with our spouse needs to be Christ-like. We need to think of Christ when we communicate with our spouses and put them first. And we don't always do that. When we upset at something, we may say something that we may regret later on. Usually that's what happens. But it's hard to put Christ first all the time when you're upset. So that's one thing we need to look at when we're not in agreement with our spouses is the communication that we say may come back to haunt us later on. Always listen attentive to your spouse when they speak. And above all else, whether it's just blowing off steam or bearing their soul, keep your communication lovingly and healthy. And don't take it out on your spouse if you're upset with at work or something's going wrong somewhere or one of your friends. Don't go home and take it out on your spouse or your kids. Always be upfront and honest with them and communicate with them in a way that's lovingly and healthy. I don't know what it is about Penny, but if I had a bad day of work or something, when I come home, I must have had a neon light flashing or something. She would always say, "What's wrong?" or "Who upset you today?" So she can always tell. The spouses always know what's going on in our lives, whether we think they do or not. So we really need to look at that. Secondly, lovingly and give perspective. Too many times when life happens, we cannot see the forest for the trees. As you talk with each other, lovingly guide your mate into understanding a realistic perspective of the interruption. Sadly, we can often either minimize the real problem to justify our own behaviors, or we can blow up a little inconvenience and stress into monstrous proportions. Remember, if the interruption involves both spouses, fear can run high and emotions can be raw, so be careful to check your own perspective and to listen. It says as much as you speak, but to get along, it's better to listen more than you speak sometimes, depending on the situation. When you're listening, always put your attention, give your undivided attention to your spouse. Too many times we'll be watching TV and they're talking and we're half listening to them, half watching TV or half reading a book or something and not really paying attention to what they're saying. And then 10 minutes later, when it comes time to do whatever they was wanting us to do, then we have to ask them again, what did you say now? So, because we wasn't really listening the first time. So just give your undivided attention when they're talking. And then when you do that, seek forgiveness and reconciliation. Without forgiveness, a relationship cannot survive. We fall short and we all hurt our spouses with words and our actions. While we don't want to use excuses or harmful behaviors, but we must live in a forgiveness, grace, and mercy with each other. How many times do we always don't want to forgive our wives or our spouses until they forgive us? We should be willing to forgive them first. Don't wait around to see who's going to be the first one to break. That just causes more tension and more trouble in the marriages. When interruptions occurs, don't argue and seek to justify your perspective. Don't delay. Just go ahead and apologize and humble yourself before God and the spouses. Apologize and ask for forgiveness. Sometimes when our spouse's lives are interrupted, the interruptions don't always affect us nearly the same way it does them. Because I'm not affected the same way, there may be a temptation to minimize the significance of the interruptions. It's just a fact. Us men handle situations different than women do. Sometimes what's major to someone may not be major to someone else. But what we got to remember, if our spouse, if it's a major situation with them, then it should be with us also. We got to be on the same page to make sure we have the same outlook of life in our marriage. And if it's important to our spouses, it's got to be important to us. During those times when their spouse may be more interruptions for them than it is for us, give extra hugs, listen more attentive, be more willing to do the things to his or her just to relieve the stress, such as helping with the chores or other household responsibilities. They always enjoy it when you help out with the household chores. I know the women really like that. So help out with that. It's the way I look at it, it's my house, the same as it is her house. So if something needs to be done, it's a joint effort for everybody to do it, to pitch in and do it. When your life is interrupted, let your spouse help you deal with the stress of the situation rather than become your target. In other words, don't bring home all your angers and fears on your spouse. If it's something that you can discuss with them, it's not something confidential, let them help you with that. How many times do we come home holding something that we should be discussing with our spouses, but yet we don't tell them, and then it just blows up later on if something happens, then it just blows up worse than what it would have had if we would have went ahead and discussed it. One of the things here is the character of the life is the when you're living your life in a marriage situation, we try to build our character of life in the 7 or 8 big moments or the big events of the world, but character is built on the hundreds of little things that go on every day in your life and your family. That's where most of the character is built. It shows through the trials and tribulations of the small things in life. We've heard the old story: the boss yells at the man comes home and yells at the wife snaps at the child kicks the dog bites the cat, and the cat kills the mouse. So that's where you need to come home and discuss things with your wife rather than coming home and jumping on her just because you're upset at someone else. Okay, it's easy to lapse into anger and frustration and depression when our lives are interrupted. But when bad things happen to us as a couple, we become so wrapped up in ourselves that we forget our mates are hurting too. Your mates may not process pain the same way you do, but that doesn't mean he or she isn't equally wounded. Remember, you are one flesh, so you walk through the dark valleys together. If your spouse is hurting, you're hurting also. And in the middle of the chaos, it's often caused by life's interruption. Help your mate to recognize that your marriage relationship is on solid ground. It's always good to let them know that you're there for them, whatever the situation may be, that you got their back. And then interruptions are a reality that we all have to deal with. Hindsight is often 20/20, and later we see the blessings in things that disrupted our lives. Joseph recognized that God uses his pain to save others, save the known world of the day. Moses realized that God is using him to forge nations of God's people. David's trials confirmed that he indeed was a man after God's own heart. And Jesus' pain saved us all. And when we look at God's Word, it becomes clear over and over again that even in the middle of all of our problem and pain, God is still in control. God is still at work, and God is still loving, gracious, and kind to all of us. We may never see that God is doing, but couples who remember that God is in control are often the ones most often to Him working through their lives, bringing reconciliation, showing love, grace, mercy, and compassion, and being the salt and the light to each other and those around. When life is interrupted, it can be painful, but remember the words of the psalmist: even though I walk through the darkest valley, you are with me. And when life is interrupted, certainly God is with us, but in marriage, we also have the opportunity to be the presence of Christ to our spouse in uniquely the powerful way. In Romans 12:1, it's, I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And in Ephesians 5:25, it's, husband, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave his life for it. I know we a lot of times ask who would give a child for somebody else, but who would die for their wife is the question tonight during our study of interruptions in our marriage. Another question is, if God loves us, why does He allow interruptions into our lives? Particularly interruptions that can affect our marriage. I don't know a good answer to that, but
I think, sometimes these things happen to you so you can learn from them.
okay.
Because, sometimes things happen in your life and you think, how am I going to get through this? Well, God gave you a spouse to help you get through it. And you should be able to learn something so you can help someone else go through it. And you may actually have, little children watching how you deal with whatever it is. And they're going to remember how you did or did not go through it. And so I think in a lot of ways God expects us to learn things from the adversity that He allows to come our way. And some of it strengthens your marriage because you learn different ways of leaning on each other for the help.
Very good. Okay, well, you can expect the unexpected. How do you and your spouse navigate interruptions in your life? During life's interruptions, we all deal with them different, depending on what kind of interruptions they are. But one thing we must always do is turn to God and pray to Him to help us through the situation. What was some of your major interruptions you had in your life in the last few months? And then how did you deal with those?
We have to be careful. Air our dirty laundry in public.
That's right.
Interruptions can be the loss of a job, maybe. Not that I've lost a job, I just don't work. Couples handle it different. Some just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Others, first thing they do is they turn to someone else and say, I need you to help me, I need you to pay my bills, I need you to do this. But major interruptions like that require both the husband and the wife to make decisions that could be short-term and long-term.
Yeah, the loss of a job would be a major interruption that would take both to navigate through life.
A sickness is a major interruption, especially some major. But what we try to do is try to handle all this ourselves and not turn it over to God.
Right. Okay, what other tips could you add to the list that might help someone here tonight that has some major life interruptions to help them to get through that? Maybe to build faith in God.
Going back 50-something years ago, when we were raising the kids, I was a stay-at-home mom. And sometimes I don't think these dads realize as stressful as it can be staying at home, they think, oh, you just got to stay at home with the kids. There's a lot more to it than that. And today, with so many moms working, I don't know how they handle it. It's got to be big interruptions to me. Trying to raise a family and work.
They're wearing a lot of hats when they do that.
They most certainly do.
Yeah, you do. That's when both spouses have to piece together and help. There's no way to have both parents working without both of them communicating and helping each other around the house that can make that work, plus raising a family. Could we have any other tips that might help someone that...
Pray. Offer.
Definitely prayer in a marriage. I know it's hard to do, but sometimes just have your spouse and pray with them. That's pretty powerful when you pray with your spouse. Anybody else have any?
Kind of touched on how important it is to talk. Just talk through things. I think something that I've kind of faced is not waiting to talk about something. You know, I have a bad habit of letting things go and not having those crucial conversations. And typically that got me in deeper than just getting it out quick. So don't wait.
Don't wait. Go ahead.
Just get it over with.
Right. Go ahead and get it over with and suffer the consequences.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Pretty much bite your tongue and give over.
That's it. Have any others?
I think it's good to know. So I'll go ahead and say this out front. I've got the best wife out of the group.
I thought I did.
All the other men out there were wondering. I know. Everybody else can tell her I said this. It's a better effect. So in our relationship, Meredith's spiritual strengths and personal strengths as a person offset my weaknesses. And I think the opposite of that is true too. My spiritual strengths fill in her spiritual her weaknesses. And knowing that, part of our premarital counseling and even conversations that we have since then, growing each other spiritually, knowing what those strengths and weaknesses are allows us to open up and communicate a little bit more freely. Interruptions come into play.
It's good to know someone's got your back in your spiritual life with your kids. Very important for raise our kids up in the church. Anybody else have anything?
One of the practical ways that we at least, and I don't know how y'all may do this, you may actually have some better ideas to teach us since we're so young. So when those moments pop up, we just remind ourselves that we're on the same team. Like sometimes we'll be in a discussion and we'll just stop it and be like, same team. Like, we're both going for the same goal here. But I'd love to hear some of those like in the moment things that y'all do as well to kind of help yourself realign when you need it.
Okay, y'all heard Patty. You want some advice? Might ask Harvey here.
There's no such thing as universal advice.
Not in a marriage.
No.
I think we got to realize everything is not a major interruption. Let's just keep the small things small, the big things big. The little ones will just take care of themselves.
You know, Randy, one of the things that we've got to realize that marriage is not a fairy tale like you started out with. It's not going to be that way. You know, you're going to have your bumps and your bruises. It's just a matter of you got to have enough confidence in you and your wife that you can get over whatever those bumps and bruises of life are, and not let it be destructive. Because, the Lord willing, Laura and I will be celebrating 47 years of marriage. And hey, that's a great accomplishment for most folks today. That's what I see in my business. Sometimes they can't last 6 months. It's the dedication you've got to have in that relationship to each other. It's not 50-50, it's 100-100. You got to put 100% into your marriage. And anybody says it's 50-50 is just fooling themselves. I mean, you know, it's not going to be perfect. And, somebody that says that they've never had an argument in their entire married life, I wonder what world they live in.
That would be a fairy
It's
tale.
not, not mine anyway.
Never go to bed mad.
True.
Good advice.
Hey, Randy, one other thing too is that you should always remember is that God wants you to be successful in your marriage. He wants you to be successful in your spiritual life, independently, but he wants you to be successful in your marriage, and he wants you to keep him in your marriage. And that's essentially how you will be successful, is to keep him. That's his desire, is that you succeed. And so all these little interruptions, things like that, it's something that God does to strengthen you, not to pry your marriage apart. So everything is teaching you how to mature and be better in that area.
Very good.
One of the beauties as being a Christian is that we have a lot of resources at our disposal. We've got brothers and sisters, older people who have experienced the things that we are and have gone through. And what there is a library of beautiful music that applies to everything we do. And I think one of the things that I have trials and tribulations with is speaking when I shouldn't be speaking, or the way in which I speak. And I learned that the angry words just hit the nail on the head. And so I thought, as often as that comes up, I copy it and reserve it down. I've got posted so I can remember those words. They're visual.
Yeah, that's what we're here for, is for each other. It'd be great if we were in an atmosphere where some of the younger people could go to the older ones for advice. That's what we're here for, is to help each other. Looks like our time is about up. If you don't have anything else, we dismissed.